When news of the Oasis reunion dropped, I probably shouldn't have been surprised to be asked by more than one person if I had paid a small fortune for a ticket to go along. Alongside the National Health Service, Greg's the Bakery, football, and institutional sexual abuse, Oasis is practically a religion in this country, and I instantly regretted whatever flippant and dismissive response I made when prompted with this question. Probably something along the lines of, I prefer to watch paint dry or something like that. Which is not even true. I'm sure the atmosphere of their shows are fucking biblical, as they say, but out of principle, I wouldn't pay 300 quid even to see Jesus of Nazareth reel through his greatest hits on the Mount. Plus, I don't think it's that controversial to suggest that Oasis are a little bit, shall we say, stodgy, kind of by design. But that aside, my dear friend's reaction to my reaction was to say, oh yeah, I bet you'd rather go listen to Scott Walker or something, which was his rather cutting and incisive way of saying that I'm a wanker. And he's not wrong. The older and naturally more out of touch that I become, the more convinced I am that there really is no good or bad music, and any music is good if there is an audience for it. And hell, maybe also when there's not. But it's good to have your friends check you sometimes, especially in moments where reflexive snobbery you might consider part of the old you rears its ugly head. But maybe the kind of elitist snobbery I have in relation to Scott Walker is perhaps one that I'm more than a little bit proud to wear, come to think of it. And as a committed fan of progressive rock, I'm not ashamed of being into stuff that I know is widely considered uncool. And also deep down, as a poptimist, I have always encouraged others to embrace musical guilty pleasures, no matter how vapid or vacuous they might be. Except maybe the Eagles. They really suck. Scott Walker, nonetheless, exists aside from all of this, perhaps even above it. Partly because, 1, he is considered part of the rock movement without really doing anything resembling rock on either disparate side of his career. 2, perhaps like the Velvet Underground, who of course are firmly of the rock idiom, Scott Walker is for the most part an extremely influential cult figure who saw very little recognition in his time, outside his mostly forgotten early pop star years of course. And thirdly, also like the Velvet Underground, Scott Walker is undeniably cool. Impossibly so even. I mean, just look at him. Scott Walker is cooler than cool. Ice cold, blacker than black. Seriously cool. And seriousness is important here. He's so serious as to be almost pompous, which is in all fairness why my friend might use Scott Walker to prick at my very own pomposity. And unlike progressive rock, which is serious in a very uncool, let's see how accurately Bill Bruford can play this polyrhythm kind of way, Scott Walker's seriousness as an artist and indeed as a person has much more to do with an older, late 50s, early 60s Beat Generation aesthetic that says, look how deeply I think about things. Like a young Bob Dylan, Scott Walker's origins are in the era of turtlenecks, wearing sunglasses indoors, shorter, smarter haircuts, chain smoking, and the sound of modern jazz wafting out breezily from the subterranean nightclubs of New York City and, of course, Gay Paris. And unlike most other, less rare adolescent male obsessions, the angry or frustrated young man thing still holds considerable romantic appeal to my mind. To paraphrase Steve Coogan in The Trip, a moody young man has a mysterious allure, whereas a moody old man is just a moody old man. Oh, what I would give to be young and unhappy again. And yes, I also went through the phase that many of us do, where I decided I was an intellectual, or at least my cartoon understanding of what intellectualism is, which mostly meant smoking a lot and reading William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac and Hunter S. Thompson, who for some reason gets thrown in with the others. As you will see, that's just table stakes for our boy Scott, who is going far deeper into the works of Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus and Jean Genet. Do you know many 20-somethings nowadays who are into European philosophy and literature? I think not. I'm ashamed to admit this, but I can't even remember the last time I finished reading a work of fiction. Such has the modern world decimated my attention span, and frankly, my day job, being chained to a desk for 8 hours a day, has also sucked away, over a decade or more, my enthusiasm for reading altogether outside of work. I realise now that I was perhaps at my intellectual peak in my early 20s when I had a dead-end menial job, because if nothing else, it afforded me the mental bandwidth to think beyond the four walls of the factory I worked in. I even kept a notebook listing all the great novels I had read and wanted to read. Oh, what I would give to be young and poor and unhappy again. But on to Scott Walker's voice. The voice. The voice, the voice, the voice. The man with the golden throat. It's difficult to know where to start with describing Scott's particular magic. But as a baritone singer, perhaps like Leonard Cohen, David Bowie, and even Elvis Presley, the drama in their voices is not born out of pushing at the very top of your range like it is for more common tenor singers in the rock idiom, and I, for one, have been guilty of that myself, as in many ways, singing high is kind of an easy fallback. For low-pitched singers, it's more about having loads and loads of character rather than urgency. Another somewhat lazy habit for a lot of singers, myself included, and Scott is guilty of making this key to his style, in all fairness, is the overuse of vibrato. It's raining today. And in all fairness, it's nigh impossible to sing without vibrato whatsoever, and to my ears, more than a little bit weird. It's raining today. Overdoing the vibrato nowadays, as well as a perhaps more extreme version of the same thing in melisma, when people go, ah, has annoyingly become some kind of badge of honour in the post-Idol era. Personally, I blame Mariah Carey and Christina Aguilera specifically for popularising such vocal gymnastics. But we forget now that even a mild vibrato was actually seen by many old pros as straight-up bad singing. There's a reason that the governor, Frank Sinatra's, use of it is so fast, effortless and subtle, because it's supposed to be part of your singing, not all of your singing. To quote Scott's vocal tutor, Freddie Winrose, I probably worked with Scott for about 18 months during the 60s, but we never could quite get rid of that vibrato. Just when I thought we had it licked, he'd disappear for a couple of months, which was very frustrating. And then in another quote, he goes on to say, Johnny Franz once said to me, Freddie, we are going to have the finest ballad singer in the world. I had to agree with him. Scott's potential was enormous. It's hard to argue with that. But the account of his vocal training under Winrose here hints at the real secret behind the magic of Scott Walker. Winrose was in fact well known for advancing a famous breath control technique, ordering Scott to pace around London, holding his breath for 7 steps at a time to build up his physicality for singing. And if you've ever tried to sing like Scott Walker yourself, you'll quickly discover, as I did, how hard it is to completely stretch out his phrasing in the way that he does, as well as including his trademark vibrato. Exhibit A.
My name would be Antonio, and all my bridges I would burn, and when I gave them some they'd know, I'd expect something in return. I'd have to get drunk every night and talk about virility with some old grandmama who might be decked out like a Christmas tree.
So how did I get into Scott? You don't ask. I suppose it was about a decade ago that I properly fell hard for Scott, insofar as collecting actual copies of his core early work and deciding quite confidently that Scott 4 was nothing short of some kind of self-evident masterwork. My earliest Scott memory, however, was from living in Melbourne about a decade earlier than that, when the social circle I moved in included a nice little band who at the time saw significant success in Australia by the name of Little Red. Their whole thing was a kind of scrappy garage band sound but with Beach Boys harmonies, and their songs, at least early on, were similarly simplistic and joyous in the best way. Despite all being singers, they did also have one sometimes standalone singer who always wore sunglasses and had specific showcase moments in their sets where he would come out from behind his Nord and sing lead in his commanding baritone. I soon learned that this was known to be doing a Scott Walker, and I distinctly remember one of the band members leaving a CD copy of Scott 2 on our sharehouse kitchen table as the main motivator for going out and torrenting Scott's complete discography at the time. And even then, I still didn't click. For years, I think I probably needed someone to give me the context I needed and say, listen to this and this, followed by this. Perhaps not unlike what I'm trying to do now with this video, selfless as I am. I apologise for the spoiler, but it's perhaps not giving too much away to reveal that Scott 4 was a total failure on just about every level, except artistically. I've previously spoken at length about the intersection between artistic triumph and commercial failure in relation to Gene Clark's No Other, and I certainly have a lot to say about the story of Alex Chilton and how failure itself, in one way or another, is key to enjoying the music. And while 99% of records ever released basically flop or otherwise fail to recoup and pay for themselves, I can't think for the life of me of a greater example than Scott 4 of an album, the artistic ambition and bravery of which so completely is matched by its level of total failure. This is not Big Star, this is not Rodriguez, this is not Nick Drake, by which I mean very, very good artists who are unfairly ignored in their time, to be discovered later on. To me, Scott 4 is an absolute genre-warping, brain-melting work of genius that was not just ignored but was buried, as if it had never even happened at all. Don't forget, a few short years earlier, Scott Walker was a household name, in the UK at least. He could not get arrested by 1969, and Scott 4 itself was deleted soon after release. I can't think of another album the ambition of which is so far removed from its contemporary reception. It's truly tragic. But maybe that's exactly what should have happened to Scott 4. Maybe it just wouldn't be right if it had sold 1 million. Scott Walker's music is tortured, perhaps because he is tortured in life and in death. Fitting for a crooner trapped in hell, as he is so often described. At the very least, he eventually took charge of that and embraced it so thoroughly in his late career. So hats off to him for that. So join me in getting to know the music and the man. An only child born into a prosperous middle-class family, Noel Scott Engel was born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1943, living all over the United States as the family shadowed his father's successful oil industry career. Traumatized by his parents' dysfunctional and abusive relationship and his mother's subsequent nervous breakdown, he took an early interest in acting, landing his first professional role in a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical at age 12. He even released his first single a couple of years later before settling in Hollywood with his mother in 1959 following his parents' divorce. He fell in love with classical and jazz music while studying the double bass and also became obsessed with European cinema, particularly the work of Ingmar Bergman, Federico Fellini and Robert Bresson. All this time he continued to pick up stage acting gigs and was pushed as a teen idol by various industry shucksters, coming this close to the big time under the mentorship of Eddie Fisher, at the time Liz Taylor's fourth husband, before quitting showbiz for the first of many times at age 19 in 1962. Turning his back on teen stardom, he then cut his teeth as a session musician, over time becoming proficient enough on multiple instruments to back up dozens of major stars on record. He fell in with another youthful showbiz all-rounder, John Moss, together deciding that they looked similar enough to each other to justify presenting themselves as a family act, and thus the Walker Brothers were born. And while the Walker Brothers brushed up against hip, up-and-coming LA groups like the Byrds and Arthur Lee's Love on the Sunset Strip, Scott in particular was far more taken with the tuxedoed, adult sophistication of crooner Jack Jones, who he more or less modelled himself on going forward. This is important as Jack Jones is the first of 3 influential figures who Scott basically intersected with artistically over the years in a way that kind of explains what Scott Walker is and the about-turns he took in his career. Obviously, the crooner aesthetic of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin and Nat King Cole speaks to an older, pre-rock and roll world of middle-aged men in tailored suits, loose tires and with a drink in one hand, singing mostly love songs to a jazz or orchestral backing. Musically, and this is particularly relevant to Scott's style in the wider context of rock, is the idea of a crooner being an intimate and soft style of singer. A style only made possible by the invention of modern microphones, something iconic crooner and notoriously unpleasant human being, Bing Crosby, personally had a major hand in. In Scott's case, this approach naturally suits him as a baritone singer, as lower-pitched voices are not only naturally quieter voices, but they simply don't cut through the midiness of guitars, drums, and other rock-oriented instrumentation. This is why someone like Jim Morrison is actually quite rare in the rock world. But of course, back in 1964, Scott was yet to fully develop this persona of his, and the Walker Brothers, of course, formed during the key year for Beatlemania. Therefore, now that we're in the era of beat groups, it stands to reason that Scott and John sought to provide their own instrumental backing on bass and guitar respectively, to be joined shortly after by mop-topped drummer Gary Leeds. In fact, at this point, Scott was not even supposed to be the main singer in the Walker Brothers. The idea was for his baritone to give John's more strident tenor harmonic support within the group. While still in the US, they were soon offered a recording contract before promptly deciding to up sticks and move to England in early 1965 as their chosen pathway to fame and success. And after slumming it and nearly giving up after 3 wintry London months, the Walker Brothers got their first big break, filling in for the Kinks on a tour supporting the Yardbirds, after a famous incident where Kinks drummer Mick Avory almost decapitated guitarist Dave Davies in an onstage fight. Initially, the Walker Brothers stage show was just the 3 of them and their instruments, eventually employing a backing group named the Quotations to do the bulk of the instrumental heavy lifting, while Scott and John in particular threw shapes to the delight of their mostly teenage fans. While Gary played drums live, his role in the group was mostly as something of a primitive hype man, with John singing lead on the rockier numbers and Scott on the ballads. This meant that Scott was the lead voice on the bulk of their hit singles, including the Phil Spector-inspired Make It Easy on Yourself and The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore, both climbing to number 1 in the UK charts and doing reasonably well back in the US also. In true 1960s fashion, the Walker Brothers secured management with dodgy underworld connections, and under the guidance of Svengali and now disgraced nonce Jonathan King, Phillips AR man John Franz, producer Peter Olive, and arrangers Reg Guest and Ivor Raymond, released 3 excellent studio albums in their short career. In 1965's Take It Easy with the Walker Brothers, 1966's Portrait, and 1967's Images. All 3 are great examples of the high-quality British pops before Sgt. Pepper properly ushered in the album's era, full of variety, up-tempo soul covers, brooding wall of sound orchestral ballads, country and western, jazz and easy listening, all written and produced by the very best in the business, with the occasional writing contribution from Scott himself. Perfectly enjoyable records, the style of which has been mostly swept away in the subsequent rock era. The Walker Brothers' brand of neurotic romanticism, providing a sonic and thematic blueprint for Scott's impending solo career. And it was on the strength of this music that the Walker Brothers became household names in the UK, with at one point, at least, having a bigger fan club than that of the Beatles. And like the Beatles, Walkermania saw the group regularly being mobbed by thousands of screaming girls at their gigs and outside their homes, to the point where they resorted to using decoy cars and wearing disguises when out in public. Proper Hard Day's Night stuff. For John and Gary, it was all a bit of a laugh. Scott found this extreme level of fame deeply disturbing, however. And while the idea of an all-American pop group reaching this kind of success seems a little out of place now, it's certainly not an unusual trajectory in the history of rock and roll. This is what I describe as the curious phenomenon of the transatlantic musical pipeline. Jimi Hendrix is the most notable example of this, and perhaps best demonstrates how and why it worked. As someone who couldn't get arrested stateside, for Hendrix to be dropped into swinging but still quite austere London in 1966 must have seemed like he was genuinely from outer space or from the future, and only after conquering that market in a few short months was he allowed to go back to the US as the all-conquering hero. And as well as the Walker Brothers, you have James Taylor, Chrissie Hynde, and Suzi Quatro making their names in the UK first, and a great number of failed attempts to do so in the proto-punk and punk eras. And as recently as the grunge and Meet Me in the Bathroom indie era, this was still a thing, with the Strokes, the White Stripes and the Killers hitting it big in the UK first before hitting it big in their homeland. The fawning of the UK press was also critical to the Foo Fighters' international breakthrough. That's right, England, the Foo Fighters are your fault. Another American who went on to make his name in England is, of course, Harry Nilsson, who shared more than a bit in common with our boy Scott, despite, as far as I know, never running into each other. For starters, like Scott, Harry Nilsson was, of course, an excellent songwriter who shot to fame mostly singing other people's songs, both of them in many ways being at least partly relics of the Tin Pan Alley approach to entertainment. Both of them also effectively refused to perform live despite their incredible talent and presence, and while I can't speak for Harry, Scott at least gave it his best in the early years, even if his fear of performing was generally far greater than Harry's, having to be either persuaded to go out on stage by others or getting pissed up before going out. And that also leads to their mutual dependence on alcohol, something I would argue is not a coincidence considering their respective connections to the UK. Take it from me, the UK is to this day a drunkard's dream. And whether or not you believe in Harry and Scott's case that it can be traced back to childhood trauma, which of course was very real for them, living in the UK as I do, you become accustomed not just to an overly permissive drinking culture, but also the presumption that everyone is a heavy drinker. And I say that as an Australian. While obviously drinking and smoking in Western culture is nothing like what it once was, I have seen Mad Men after all. The UK didn't quite get the self-improvement, clean living bug that the US did from the 80s onwards, except for Gen Z, who basically can't afford to have fun anymore. At a guess, it's probably just a way of coping with the weather here, especially the further north that you go. So while again, like Nilsson, alcohol came to increasingly dominate Scott's life later on as the hits dried up, boozing was of course a decidedly unhip indulgence in the mid to late 60s as swinging London turned to pot and LSD as the zeitgeisty habits of choice. But Scott outright dismissed the use of drugs at the time and saw the perhaps pretentious romance in staying up all night reading Hemingway, Dickens and Dylan Thomas by candlelight with a bottle of scotch in hand. But it was more than that for Scott, a crutch under the increasing pressure of extreme fame, his fear of performing, fear of flying and increased paranoia leading up to Scott's first suicide attempt in 1966. While John Moss also went on to have his own battle with the bottle, all of these pressures sought to pull the Walker brothers apart, who, let's not forget, the oldest of whom was only 25 years old at the time, just before the summer of love and psychedelia came to dominate music on both sides of the Atlantic. They managed a tour of Singapore, Japan and Australia and a final package tour of the UK featuring Jimi Hendrix, Cat Stevens and Engelbert Humperdinck before imploding. And in a fairly on-brand move for Scott, he decamped to a Benedictine monastery on the Isle of Wight to study Gregorian chant and lick his wounds while plotting a solo career. It was around this time that Scott fell under the spell of the second most significant musical figure in his life after Jack Jones, that being the Belgian chanson singer and actor Jacques Brel. Brel's theatrical approach, working exclusively in French of course, from the start of his career in the mid-50s to his major rise to fame a full decade later, was his dramatic and tortured approach to performing, with dark and stormy songs about the depths of human depravity and destruction, clearly an enormous influence on Scott. So much though, that despite supposedly never meeting in person, Brel officially endorsed Scott Walker as his spiritual heir, instructing American writer Mort Schumann to translate Brel's songs exclusively into English for Scott's benefit. Using much of the same production crew as the Walker Brothers albums, Scott's first solo record, the inventively titled Scott, was released in mid-1967 and featured 3 Brel compositions including album opener Matilda, My Death and perhaps Brel's most famous song, Amsterdam. It's an excellent record with a pleasing stylistic variety, up-tempo cinematic romps, a taste of country and western, soaring ballads and just a bit of schmaltzy filler. Nothing that I personally have a problem with. Reaching an impressive number 3 on the UK chart for a solo debut, as a statement of intent, it speaks to Scott's decidedly European black and white aesthetic, released smack bang in the summer of love and at its explosion of Paisley. And personally, as a foreigner living in the UK, in my humbleness, the only commonality between Scott and myself that I would dare to point out, I have a lot of sympathy with Scott's clear romantic longing for life on the continent. For people born and raised here, I'm sure it seems unremarkable, but I'm sure most others would agree that the lure of Europeanness is really seductive for outsiders, especially people like myself and our main man Scott, who feel like they came from the middle of nowhere. Europe is somewhere, very often somewhere impossibly beautiful. Have you ever sat in a cafe in Paris and watched the afternoon sun move across the city's ornate architecture, sipping a glass of wine while an old man plays an accordion on the cobblestone street corner, to the indifference of well-dressed commuters? Some of the most romantic memories of my life have been from doing nothing more than observing life in that grimy, stinking city of love.
When Joanna loved me, every town was Paris. Paris on a Sunday. Every month was May.
And that's just Paris. Most European cities are like this in one way or the other. For people like me, it's like being in a movie. And despite everything, this Europe still exists and is inviting all of us to fall in love again. So no wonder Scott 1 was a hit, despite Scott's best efforts to sabotage it as he so often did, refusing to tour it beyond a handful of cabaret appearances and TV spots, which he also hated. His second album, released in early 1968, given the inspired title of Scott 2, indeed reached number 1 in the UK and represents Scott's commercial career peak. Like its predecessor, it includes an obligatory Tim Hardin tune and several Jacques Brel compositions, old Jacques providing some of the most brutal and in many ways offensive language you could ever imagine on a number 1 pop record in 1968. Now, I always will recall the brothel truck, the flying flags, the queer lieutenant who slapped our asses as if we were fags. I swear on the wet head of my first case of gonorrhea, it's his ugly voice that I forever hear. And then later on,
one day I'll cut my legs off and burn myself alive. I'll do anything, anything just to survive and never to be next.
Jackie, the album's lead single, also written by Jacques Brel, was also banned by the BBC for its reference to authentic queers and phony virgins and other references to drugs. And alongside that, the underworld and oftentimes hellish imagery is a flavour of a playful, surreal psychedelia, especially on tracks like The Amorous Humphrey Plug and Plastic Palace People, both written by Scott himself. It's a fantastic album, and were it not for it actually selling really well at the time, I would have been tempted to make it the subject of this video. I'll say as well, the second track, Best of Both Worlds, gets my vote for being Scott's single finest vocal performance.
I can satisfy you. You want best of both worlds. Make your fickle mind up. I won't stay while you enjoy best of both worlds.
In typical Scott fashion, he claimed you hate the record, declaring it the work of a lazy, self-indulgent man. He nonetheless found a degree of happiness with his Danish girlfriend and later wife, Mette Tybug, settling into a routine of sporadic live appearances strictly for the sake of keeping the wolf from the door. Released in early 1969, the cunningly titled Scott 3 saw him turn away from the big, bombastic orchestrations of his previous 2 albums, also composing the majority of its tracks himself for a change. While it is fantastic and near perfect, Two Ragged Soldiers perhaps being my personal favourite track on it, Scott 3 is noticeably slower and sombre compared to Scott's previous works, something reflected in its muted reception, reaching a paltry number 3 in the UK charts. Off the back of this, amazingly, Scott was given his own weekly BBC television show where he got to sing songs and have guests on in a controlled setting that helped to ease his natural stage fright. The resultant album, Scott Sings Songs from His TV Show, is a good example of someone in the rock idiom doing what is essentially a classics or standards album, one that his vocal coach Freddie Winrose at least believes to be Scott's high watermark as a singer. He was extremely busy in this year, producing other artists in the background and travelling back and forth between London, Copenhagen and Amsterdam with his young bride-to-be. Scott 3's comparatively low sales somehow convinced Scott his next album needed to be more indulgent rather than less. And considering avant-garde and psychedelic music was very much in the air at the time, I can sympathise with that rationale. Although I would say Scott's undoing was having to straddle that fine line between the teeny bopper pop that brought him to fame and the underground sounds that were clearly steering the culture in 1969. He certainly didn't help himself by declaring that he would drop his stage name and release his next record under his birth name of Scott Engel. Big mistake, pal. Something that really defines Scott Walker's career more broadly is his refusal to be defined in terms of genre, both in his early pop phase and his latter-day experimental phase. While Scott 4 sits roughly in the middle of his uneven pop phase and in many ways provides a bridge between the two halves of his career, it is still musically, if not thematically, still very much part of what the Walker brothers were doing while they were around. And even that mostly defies genre. I mean, aside from them being Americans in Britain and therefore outsiders to begin with, at the heights of their careers, the Walker brothers and Scott as a solo artist were providing a counterpoint to and a competition with Beatlemania as well as the main explosion of swinging London psychedelia. And in so many ways, they were doing this through utilising or co-opting the pre-existing older system of music making that predated the Beatles entirely, both in Britain and the United States. While we think of the 60s now as being all about beat combos, psych, and late-decade bluesy hard rock, it's easy to forget that the charts and therefore the music industry itself was then, and it pretty much always has been throughout history, completely saturated with disposable pop. And even if the Beatles sat on top of this pyramid of pop in terms of commercial success, the Beatles were odd in that they were relatively self-contained. For the bulk of the industry then was of course made up of mostly nameless and faceless professional songwriters, session musicians and producers, clocking in at 9 a.m. in their suits and ties to help churn out hits by the likes of Cilla Black, Cliff Richard, Engelbert Humperdinck and Tom Jones. Rock, as a genre, sought to, over time, sweep away the old industry entirely, but it still took until about halfway into the following decade for that to come fully into effect. There is also a huge crossover with the British film and television industries here as well, of course also almost entirely based in London, and that's why cultural artifacts like the James Bond theme or whatever are among the few remnants of this straight or establishment side of 60s British entertainment business that still remain in the public consciousness. And you can hear more than a hint of that in Scott's 60s work. So the Walker brothers and of course Scott were tapping into that. And it may have been a convenient and perhaps natural direction to go in, because as Americans they were coming from a place where the old industry had even more of a grip on how music was made, which is why session musicians still tended to dominate the recordings of first-wave American rock groups like the Byrds and the Beach Boys, and of course Motown, Stax and all the rest. Scott Walker as a solo artist quite obviously comes from the distinctly un-British American post-war crooner thing, and during the 60s perhaps shared the sophisticated, easy-listening and orchestral leanings of someone like Burt Bacharach. That said, either intended through choice of material and through sheer delivery, classic-era Scott Walker has a depth that you simply don't get with the likes of Tom Jones and Scott's other contemporaries. In fact, he absolutely hated any such comparison. Personally, when I really got the Scott bug and had exhausted his first big 4 solo records, I was desperate to find more music just like this, and was bitterly disappointed that no one else seemed to make music of this specific kind. The closest anyone comes to, in my mind, would be Lee Hazelwood, but obviously he is mining his own adjacent but distinctly different psychedelic cowboy scene over here. Serge Gainsbourg? Maybe a bit. Scott, it would seem, just does his own thing, which as best as I can describe it is lush pop, but somehow scary, Baroque pop, but without any of that genre's harpsichordy affectations, Gothic pop, but also without any of that genre's affectations, orchestral pop, but with occasional rock flourishes maybe. Perhaps chamber pop is the best word for what it is. Uneasy listening, maybe. Whatever you want to call it, Scott 4 represents the absolute pinnacle of it, as Scott himself wrote all the material on the album for the first time in his career and had the most control over its production. And interestingly, and perhaps an attempt to move beyond the mid-60s pop aesthetic and respond to what may have passed for cool in 1969, Scott 4 is less orchestral than its predecessor, with slight nods to rock in its arrangements. The dominant instrument sounds to me like a nylon stringed or classical guitar, although to be fair, it can be very difficult to distinguish that from a steel-stringed acoustic when played delicately with the fingers. Either way, the acoustic guitar provides a stately foundation for most of Scott 4's tracks, perhaps providing a function similar to that of Baroque pop staple, the harpsichord, an instrument perhaps tokenistically overused in other, lesser works of the era. The delicately finger-picked guitar of Simon and Garfunkel records of the time are clearly a far stronger influence to my mind, as is folk music generally, and a particular nod must go to Dion's 1968 self-titled album, apparently one of Scott's favourites, to explain Scott 4's contemporary leanings. Beyond that, and of course, Ivor Raymond's or Angela Morley's relatively sparse but ever-present string arrangements, we also get some very specific and iconic instrumental choices across Scott 4 that provide a sprinkle of exotic gold dust, from mariachi trumpets, vibes, Gregorian chanters, pedal steel guitar, and whatever on earth that incredible instrument is at the start of Boy Child. Arrangements aside, from a compositional perspective, Scott himself could not have been further away from the pop and rock so prevalent in the culture at the time, citing Beethoven, Shostakovich, and Brahms as Scott's top picks for the year 1969. Cool, man. And while I can't claim to be studied enough to point to evidence on Scott 4 of these classical influences, many of the songs on Scott 4 disregard your normal verse-chorus-verse norms of pop and rock altogether, and at least one track does not appear to have any discernible meter or rhythm to it at all. Abbey Road, this ain't. And while Scott 4's tracks might mostly lack the upbeat, high-energy urgency that listeners in 1969 were no doubt accustomed to in their pop and rock, the album is not without its otherwise moments of musical edginess, let's say. Outside of the ballads that make up the bulk of its songs, we still get a couple of strident epics, cocktail bar toe tappers, and in one particular track that everyone knows, an adult dose of that signature and timeless Scott Walker cool. And just as Scott's ambitions for the music seemingly know no bounds, very few 26-year-olds then, and especially not now, operating in the music world, are capable of writing lyrics quite like this. To quote the man himself in 1976, Scott 4 tried to link lyrics by Sartre, Camus, and Yevtushenko to Bartok modal lines, but nobody noticed. What a surprise this went over so many people's heads. It is fundamentally pretentious, and that's why I love it. Although I should say, the lyrics on Scott 4 are far more subtle than the fire and brimstone we've hitherto come to expect from the tortured mind of the young Scott Walker. Outside of one track's description of a disfigured war hero, less apparent is the graphic realism and brutality of his earlier Brel-inspired writing, in favour of something altogether more nuanced, delicate and questioning, and yet somehow still very dark, almost by suggestion. This is music made, and certainly best listened to, by candlelight, where you don't dare look too closely into the shadows for fear of what might be lurking there. And finally, a distinct bit of flavour you get on Scott 4, including in the album artwork, is a bit of the old Soviet chic, something I have a lot of time for aesthetically. And while this kind of thing has popped up fairly often, at least superficially, in Western popular culture since, I can't think of many musical artists drawing from this particular well as far back as 1969, at the height of space race Cold War paranoia. And from an American too, no less. And while Scott, like many a young man, before or since, indeed harboured some fairly robust and radical left-wing sympathies. The allusions to the Soviet Union on Scott 4 are presented less with political comment and more with a perhaps impressionistic reading of a current news event, not unlike the plot of the film he reimagines on the album's opening track. And on that note, let's get stuck into it. And with the confident flourish of a bullfighter or a gunslinger stepping up to his mark, we are brought into the story of the Seventh Seal with this meterless musical prelude.
Anybody seen a night pass this way?
The mariachi trumpet reimagines Ingmar Bergman's 1957 Plague-era masterpiece as a spaghetti western. Unusual on this album as a fairly contained third-person linear narrative, The Seventh Seal is perhaps not out of step with the kind of jaunty, more strident songs that Scott tended to open his solo albums with in the 60s, with the exception, of course, of Scott 3. It is, however, far more widescreen and filmic in its lyrics and production. The lyric retells the plot of the film fairly straightforwardly. A knight returns from the Crusades to find his Swedish hometown ravaged by the Black Death, only to be challenged to a high-stakes game of chess with Death himself. You know, the usual stuff. Reading it now, I find it almost funny how closely it mirrors the film beat by beat. But more than anything, it lays out the epicness of Scott's ambition for the album more broadly. And as exciting as the story might be, it's the drama of the composition and its apocalyptic production that really seals the deal.
His crusade was a search for God, and they say it's been a long way to carry on.
After the tease of the introduction, the percussion takes up the main drive of the track, with the tambourine complementing the strum of the acoustic guitar, which provides the basis of the track. After taking off fairly minimally, the swelling strings make an appearance for the second verse, and then, with the first modulation, lifting the whole song up a semitone for the start of verse 3.
My life's a vain pursuit of meaningless miles.
Considering the wider structure of the tune is simply built around repeating the same chord sequence again and again with no real chorus, bridge or instrumental break, it suits the song's narrative that the drama or the harmonic interest, let's say, is simply created by just changing key as it does twice at the beginning of each double verse. It elevates the song each time, successively raising the stakes in this epic game of death. And on top of that, the arrangement continues to evolve with the addition of bells, an ever busier string part, and the return of the mariachi trumpet, weaving around the lyric. The highlight to my ears, however, is what I'm going to call the Gregorian chant backing vocals, that enter around the third verse. And it sounds less like a couple of double-track Scots and more like an ocean of male voices. Not the last time Scott would add this specific dash of biblical flavour to a track on this record. And just as the arrangement reaches its peak, the narrative winds up with the story's protagonist disappearing over the hillside and into the distance in a dance of death. Heavy.
Wasn't it a good year? Wasn't full of talking.
And with the opening of On Your Own Again, it's probably the couplet that pops into my head or moves through my heart, as Scott would have it, more than any other on a record already full of earworms and memorable moments, for weirdos at least. Wasn't it a good year? Wasn't full of talking. Only someone like Scott would look so fondly upon silence. The song brings us down to earth after the drama of The Seventh Seal, an almost stream of consciousness in a monologue regarding a love long lost and Scott's own efforts to build himself back up in spite of this painful memory. This is reflected musically also, as after two fairly baroque sounding and sparse verses, the song actually picks up just a bit of forward momentum here.
You're on your own again, and you're your best again. That's what you tell yourself. I've seen it all the way. way as far as anyone could see.
Except for when it began, I was so happy I didn't feel like me. I can't tell you how tragic that line is, basically saying that he's not himself when he is happy, as if he doesn't deserve happiness. I'm sure anyone with experience of depression understands where he is coming from there. Less of a song, more of a delicate and forlorn vignette, all over in less than 2 minutes, and certainly a fitting bridge between two perhaps more substantive tracks on Scott 4. The first thing that I always hear on this track, other than the apparent tape warp in the opening second, which has been corrected in some versions of the album but not in others, I've therefore kind of lost track or ability to hear it either way, is the gentle lope of the 4-on-the-floor rhythm part, and with it a deliciously 60s combination of organ, vibes and plunky electric guitar. As ever, it features a note-perfect, heavenly vocal performance from Scott with some gorgeous and vulnerable lyrics. The track also contains a ubiquitous, lush string arrangement, some nice busyness in the bass guitar, and if you listen carefully, a subtle bit of pedal steel that we hear featured more prominently later on the album. Barely longer than its predecessor, it doesn't feel short in the best possible way, containing only 2 verses and a scat singing outro. More on that later. Angels of Ashes is substantive, not just in terms of its length, but also the way, into my mind, it kind of pushes you relentlessly, again in the best possible way, with verse after verse, in a way that's somehow Dylan-y to my ears. Not in a rapid-fire wordplay way, of course, but just how each verse is more beautiful and poetic than the last, like he's just throwing out this pure celestial imagery straight from his soul, like he is channeling something holy. I can't even pretend to know what it means, but even taken abstractly, the lyrics cradle you emotionally as he weaves this sort of heady romance. The line that sticks out for me is,
I can recommend angels.
Yeah, we know, Scott, because you are of the angels. It's like he's singing to us from heaven. His central chord progression is simple and repetitive as to not even really be there. It's repetitious in a way that the arrangement doesn't even attempt to modulate or build tension or suspense like, say, The Seventh Seal does. It does the opposite of that. It's supposed to seduce you, to intoxicate you as it goes around and around. And before you know it, you're up among the clouds with Scott. And its central melodic motif, first sung with words, then without words, then taken up by other instruments, including a very dainty harpsichord part that really brings the Baroque. As ever, there's a gorgeous string part also that comes to dominate the otherwise sparse arrangement. You can say that he laughed and walked like St. Francis with love. It's a beautiful final couplet that really brings Angels of Ashes to a lovely close. So we're well into the meat of Scott 4 now, of course, and as a sequencing decision, I do appreciate that the divine seriousness of Angels of Ashes is followed by Boy Child, which is perhaps even more punishing in its existential rawness, let's say. In the lyric, he regresses back into little Scott Engel, the boy child, vulnerable and scared. Musically, I can only describe it as somehow invoking the sound of being suspended in the air or flying through the sky. Musically, other than Scott's voice, the song is almost entirely an orchestra shifting fairly loosely between a handful of block chords, the kind of thing people would use an ambient synth pad for nowadays. The most striking thing is the instrument playing the single note melody at the start and again later in the song. I first had thought it could simply be a plucked acoustic guitar, but I suspect it was likely a dulcimer played with mallets or hammers. Maybe something like this. But not awful and crap. Someone somewhere must have used this in a film. It's a sound that once you hear it, it never really leaves you. It's genuinely haunting. And not just the sound of it, but harmonically as well. So if the underlying droning chord is a C, that's the first chord with the melody on top of it, which is unusual but fair enough. But then when the underlying chord goes to the G, that's the full chord with the melody added to it. So from there to there,
It's harmonically quite dissonant.
Mysterious, sublime, full of wonder and dread. That's Boy Child. What a way to close side one. Alright now, so opening up side 2, we've got a welcome change of pace with Hero of the War, and its gentle if nonetheless rousing Bo Diddley beat. The lyric takes a sideways look at war heroism, of course 1969 being the height of America's war with Vietnam.
He's the hero of the war. All the neighborhood is talking about your son. Mrs. Riley, get his medals, hand them round to everyone.
Show his gun to all the children in the street. It's too bad he can't shake hands or move his feet. In it, Scott sings to the war hero's mother, Mrs. Riley, and it's unclear through the text, particularly with the line, "It's too bad he can't shake hands or move his feet," whether or not the hero is returning home merely disfigured or indeed in a box. My guess is the former rather than the latter. It otherwise does not affect the thrust of the song for the most part. Scott is/was an avowed pacifist, but I don't reckon the lyrics sneer at its subject at all. And if anything, speaks to the futility of war and its effect on everyone, which is surely a sentiment we can all get behind. The string arrangement is really imaginative in the way it darts around and augments the tune. In some of the swells, I also hear a bit of psychedelic phasing or flanging in it too, which I really love. Like most of the album's tracks, it doesn't try to get too clever structurally, and it's all over in 2.5 minutes. And not without its excellent scatty outro. Now, I've heard some people say that scat singing is stupid and cringy in some way. I mean, sure it kind of is when I do it. But when Scott does it, it's super cool. In the context of the song, it's also kind of an ironic way to close out a tragic war story. So I'm sorry to say, but those people are wrong. I know a lot of jazz heads are quite snobby about it, but at the end of the day, where would we be without Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, or Ella Fitzgerald? Nowhere. That's where. Scott's a proper 20th century singer. He's going to use everything in his arsenal. And he was clearly into it. In at least 4 of this album's song outros, Scott does a scat bit, and they are all highlights that I look forward to. The Old Man's Back Again, the standout track on an album of only standout tracks, maybe even the single standout track of Scott Walker's entire career, solo or otherwise. And yet, I'm ashamed to say its brilliance only dawned on me after I had already become quite familiar with his other work. I was indeed surprised to see it as his top track on Spotify for what it's worth. On learning that, I thought it must have been used in a film or a top TV show or something, but it hasn't. I mean, it has, but just not in anything major. Perhaps The Old Man's Back Again is just one of those rare examples of something amazing being properly appreciated in the culture. But anyway, it's almost a cliche, this song, how good it is. And I'm never not in the mood to hear the whole thing when it comes on. An ultimate walking down the street feeling cool kind of a tune. So what is it? Well, on the surface, it's conceptually based around the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union and friends. And despite being a card-carrying socialist, something perhaps not unusual in the UK in 1969, but certainly unusual for an American, Scott was nonetheless inspired to register his displeasure at the situation in song. Taken literally, the lyrics read as a perhaps detached and dispassionate depiction of the invasion, although anything relating to Czechoslovakia itself is referenced obliquely at best. What I think the song does so well is instead evoke the ordinary fears of all the, let's say, less willing peasantry of Eastern Europe, either militarily or at best culturally occupied by the USSR under Joseph Stalin's reign specifically, the old man of the song's title. Old Uncle Joe himself is pictured on the album's gatefold sleeve to remove any illusion of doubt on the real subject of the song, the shadow that stretches across this land. But what the song puts across as equally as fear is awe, an almost biblical wonder at this brutal regime, verging on fetishization, or at best Soviet chic. Taken with the laid-back cool of the music itself, the song's imagery is cool and striking and scary all at once. Like the rest of this record, it's still a simple strummed acoustic guitar at its very core, with a stirring and dramatic string arrangement. But of course, what everyone talks about is the rhythm section, who really bring the cool on this one. The bass is performed not by Scott, as was rumoured for many years, but instead by session man Dave Richmond, gets a lot of the credit. And in all fairness, it is phenomenal in how busy it is and yet so perfect for the song.
Your man's back again. I see he's back again.
I mean, he's even bending the strings on it. For a bass player, that's just showing off. There's a YouTube commenter saying that it's like the sound of a stranger rummaging through your backpack, which I think is an apt description of the bass part. That said, the drum part, played by session man Terry Cox, while quite minimalist and delicate, could be reasonably described as a proto-hip-hop beat, and the double shuffle rhythm thing that he does before each chorus is, in my opinion, the single thing that just makes the track. But for all that, the credit must go to Scott himself. I never hear people mention the ghost vocal that can just about be heard at around 22 seconds, and of course the album's second appearance of the epic Gregorian chant backing vocals. Seriously, I don't know how anyone can produce a sound like that without a legion of singers. But all that aside, the lead vocal is just the coolest thing ever. And the scat he does at the end, oh my god. I mean, I still stand by my claim that Gimme Shelter is the best single rock recording ever, but The Old Man's Back Again has got to be the coolest. Duchess provides a change of pace as an aching country ballad, probably the standout ballad on Scott 4, certainly its most plaintive torch song style. And while the pedal steel is only heard fleetingly elsewhere on the album, here it is front and centre. It's beautiful and played especially slowly. I've talked before about how difficult it is to play slowly. I think they really must have gotten some session heavy hitters in for this one. It's hard enough for a drummer to play at consistently such a slow pace without speeding up, and it's perhaps even harder to play with them this slowly, because if you misjudge their lead, even by a nanosecond, your mistakes are so much more obvious. With your shimmering dress, it says no, it says yes. It says, I've nothing left for concealing. It's your shiftless flesh and your old girl's grace. It's your young girl's face that I'm breathing. Dion's 1968 self-titled album was supposedly a major influence on Duchess. I can kind of hear how it has that Greenwich Village, Fred Neil sort of energy about it. Get Behind Me is yet another favourite of mine, one that I think calls back somewhat to Scott's earlier catalogue. Triumphant, not unlike the spirit of We Came Through on Scott 3, although musically far more of a laid-back but epic cool, like The Old Man's Back Again. And while the refrain of Get Behind Me comes over as a very rousing, of the time, Age of Aquarius, Children of the Revolution type of thing, Scott being Scott, I could equally imagine Get Behind Me to be more about moving on from things and leaving the past in the past. And the somewhat epic and foreboding verses kind of hint at this, I think. When the threads of dark moments start to tremble with sound, and an almost formed whisper dies, the boundaries surround. We keep reaching beyond us through the shape-shifting clouds. Why ain't I like you, brother? So electric, so proud. Unlike the other acoustic guitars on Scott 4, the one in the introduction of the song is clearly a steel string 12-string with touches of vibes giving way to a quite full-blown chorus, a rare fuzz guitar, a rare horn section, and for the first and last time on the album, a female chorus of backing singers, giving the track a hint of soul. The bass part is busy and inventive, much like on The Old Man's Back Again, although this time it is played by the legendary Herbie Flowers. What he does in the chorus is frankly demented, and I love it. From the second verse, you also get a string section and timpani, so they've really thrown the kitchen sink at this one, and rightly so. A classic Scott Walker belter, really pumps my tyres, this tune. And as ever, Scott cannot resist more scat singing in the song's fade out, and frankly, neither can I. Now, Get Behind Me would have made for an excellent album closer in my view, but it's even better that Rhymes of Goodbye is kind of tacked on at the end of the album to my mind. It's a victory lap of sorts. Lovely also that it's the only song in 6/8 and leans further still into the twang of the country guitars, just nicely rounding out Scott 4 with just a little more variety. While I think the album is across the board of a singular mood, it's tracks like this where you get reminded how much music is packed into these mostly tightly written and musically unindulgent songs, for the most part. The initial campfire folk vibe of Rhymes of Goodbye recalls Scott's earlier and frequent interpretations of Tim Hardin songs with their homely warmth and troubadour charm. And suitable for the country folk vibe of the song, its initial verse certainly pictures Scott as a weary traveller returning home only with the expansive chorus taking on an epic and inspecific profoundness with the strings, horns and, of course, Scott's soaring vocal. And on reflection, the lyrics of Rhymes of Goodbye are much like all of those on Scott 4, in that not only can I not offer much of a literal line-by-line interpretation of them, but in fact doing so is unnecessary and would perhaps distract from this music meant to be taken holistically.
And roaring through darkness, the night children fly. Still hear them singing the rhymes of goodbye.
I couldn't tell you what it means, but I can tell you it's beautiful. And in just over 3 minutes, the masterpiece that is Scott 4 has drawn to a close. Scott 4 was released in November 1969 under Scott's birth name, Scott Engel, with little to no fanfare, not helped at all by his own refusal to tour and Philip's refusal to promote the record. Indeed, the record label was growing tired of his increasingly uncommercial output, having made such a strong start to his solo career. And his hitherto loyal fans agreed, turned off by Scott 4's somber atmosphere and pretentious lyrics. Scott had also severed ties with his manager, Maurice King, just prior to the album's release, and its mixed reviews and poor sales saw Scott 4 deleted shortly after initial release. Deeply hurt by the reception his masterpiece received, Scott virtually withdrew from public life, spending more and more of his time bar hopping across Europe, claiming once again to have quit music entirely, once again. However, after about a year, he made a concession to the record label with 1970's Till the Band Comes In, returning to the previous, more successful formula of mixing original material with covers. On this one, he leans further into trad jazz and country influences, and I adore this album and consider it a key part of his original classic run of solo records. And I don't really go for the popular argument that it's significantly let down by its second side. I mean, sure, it's a bit schlocky, but I think it feels worse for having followed the original genius of Scott 4, and is therefore judged unfairly in comparison. And I would say that argument really only works if you find schlock that offensive. Scott always walked the fine line between artistic genius and middle-of-the-road mawkishness, and personally, I'm pretty immune to that. To my ears, his voice sells whatever he is singing. That's how good he is. A bad song is good if sung by the right singer. To quote from the Big Star documentary that came out a few years ago, I'd rather hear Alex Chilton sing Volare for the millionth time than have to listen to Arcade Fire. And I can't help but agree with that. But in all fairness, Scott increasingly came down on the wrong side of that line for the first half of the 70s, releasing a string of mostly easy listening, movie-themed standards and country music albums as his audience went down and his drinking went up. Unlike Scott 4, which was of course rediscovered many years later, these albums were properly buried until after his death, almost impossible to find, and have only just seen them appear on Spotify for the first time in this year, 2025. In all honesty, they are mostly, at worst, pleasant listens, if inessential. He reunited with the Walker Brothers for 3 creatively mixed and commercially disappointing albums between 1975 and 78. The last of these, Night Flights, containing 4 Scott originals, his first since 1970s Till the Band Comes In. And in these 4 tracks, especially The Electrician, we hear the terrifying sound that came to form the basis for his entire latter-day career. It took him another 6 years to produce a full-length album along these lines, with 1984's Climate of Hunter, then another 11 years until really finding his new niche with Tilt in 1995. And by niche, I mean Scott came to produce music that was punishingly industrial, bleak and scary. It's incredible stuff, but far from tuneful, tuneless for the most part, and fans of his early work best be warned. I think it's powerful and forward-thinking, not just because it again so thoroughly defies definition, but because at the centre of it all is Scott's incredible, unshakably powerful voice. While he was never as prolific in his late career as he was in the 1960s, he clearly fell in love with music again in later life, releasing The Drift in 2006, Bish Bosh in 2012, and Soused in 2014. While I am not intimately familiar with all of these, The Drift is the one I've gravitated towards with its nightmarish revisionist history lyrics and outside-the-box production that includes punching slabs of meat and squeezing donkeys into microphones. There's a particular moment in the song The Escape that really made me shit myself the first time I heard it. If you know, you know. It's horror music. That's the best way to describe it. And if anything, it adds to the underlying darkness of his more pop-oriented 60s work, as Scott's personal torment is the common thread throughout both distinct phases of his career. It's interesting to think that his music only got increasingly darker as he grew older and made peace with his life and his art, enjoying a warm, if relatively unglamorous cult figure anonymity alongside alternative rock elder statesman status, buoyed in no small part by an ever-growing interest in his 60s work. The seeds of this were planted in 1981 when Julian Cope first compiled Fire Escape in the Sky, the Godlike Genius of Scott Walker compilation, beginning the revival of Scott's critical fortunes. David Bowie went on to cover some of his late period work, acknowledging Scott's enormous influence on his own career. I consider David Bowie to be the third key figure in understanding Scott Walker after Jack Jones and Jacques Brel. Not, however, because of Bowie's effect on Scott, but instead Scott's effect on Bowie. It's of course widely acknowledged that so much of Bowie's genius is in his ability to co-opt, or perhaps less charitably, steal bits of other artistic personas to fold into his own, not least of all Jacques Brel also. But personally, the more I got to understand Scott and Bowie, the more apparent to me just how much of Scott is in Bowie's voice, his stage manner, and his songwriting, especially his Thin White Duke and Berlin Trilogy phases. I'd even go so far as to say Bowie's swan song and horror jazz masterpiece, Black Star, could not be more late period Scott coded if he tried. Scott Walker passed away from cancer at age 76 in 2019 in London, the city he first made his home at the age of 22. I often fantasize about unknowingly passing Scott Walker in the street, perhaps on his bicycle with his shopping, and maybe wondering what he made of this mad, mad city from the window of his bedsit or whatever. I'd like to think he is part of London even all these years after he is gone. It took a hell of a long time for Scott 4 to get the credit it deserved, and was not even made available again until 1992 on CD. It's now widely considered his single best work, even if it's still relatively unknown, and Scott Walker for most rock and pop fans is a mildly familiar name at best. His influence is nonetheless enormous. Two fairly obvious descendants of his pop crooner Trapped in Hell phase would be Jarvis Cocker and Nick Cave, and as much as I like both of them, neither of them have got the looks or the voice. Scott is the original, the real deal, the iconic tortured 60s pop singer. And while his work from that time is clearly the more accessible, I suspect it will be his Stockhausen era that will really continue to blow people's heads in the long run. So forward-thinking and beyond comprehension it often is, even now. It's almost like he did the pop stuff early in order to wave the dark stuff under our noses while we weren't looking. And I say that as someone who's still yet to fully appreciate his later work. I'm also someone who has gotten a lot of mileage out of someone who never even listened to his own records again after making them. Scott is my spirit animal. I even keep a picture of him on the wall behind me here. He watches me from above with his sullen but sultry benevolence as I sit in this room, farting and tapping at a computer for 8 hours a day. And while I look in the mirror each morning and note the ravages of time, inside I am still the brooding 20-year-old, walking around in my own cloud of doom and taking comfort in my own romantic self-pity. In these quote-unquote interesting times, maybe we could all do with being just a little more like Scott, or at the very least, let a little more Scott into our grey lives. Everyone who has ever made music fantasizes about making their masterpiece. Something perfect to be remembered by, or at least something perfect we could throw out to the universe when we are otherwise completely forgotten. And yet, Scott 4 can only be this good because somebody like Scott Walker was not thinking about this at all. He was simply making the best art that he could in the moment based on the many creative influences and inputs he fed into his psyche. Someone who never chased fame, but instead, with this, achieved a degree of immortality that is surely the envy of 99% of creative people. Pretentious? Yes, because someone has to be. If Scott Walker didn't exist, someone would have to invent him. And up there in heaven, or elsewhere, Scott Walker is providing the soundtrack and taking his job extremely seriously. Get behind him.